Hey, welcome back to another video. Now, recently I've been thinking about the different ways I try and approach different challenging situations and how I try to logically think through those challenges. And I seem to have noticed that my thinking is quite restricted. I don't seem to have enough mental models. My toolbox of thought doesn't seem to be that broad. And so what I wanted to do was sort of dive into these different disciplines, these different areas of learning, of knowledge, of industry that I can use to apply into my own areas of life. So for example, the engineer will think in systems, they'll have systems thinking, that'll be their mental model. Or you think of the psychologist, they'll think in incentives. The lawyer, they'll think in terms of logical reasoning. And so I wanted to go into these different areas and find out what are the mental models and how can I apply those to my own life. Now, there are literally millions of different mental models that I could apply to my own life. So I'm only going to choose 9 of my favourite, and they're going to be from a few different areas, and I'm going to show you the different examples that I've used in the past or I'm using right now to apply these mental models to my life and how they're so useful to overcoming the challenges that I'm faced with every single day. So the first mental model I really like is that the map is not the territory. In other words, when we're looking at a map, we're not actually getting a perfect representation of what the land or the territory is going to look like. We're only given a sort of holistic overview of what we could be faced with once we go to that area and start walking on that land. You know, you can have a map that tells you it's going to be quite steep here, there's going to be a river here, but it doesn't actually tell you how muddy that land's going to be or how difficult it's going to be to cross that land. So remembering that the map is not the territory is very important when it comes to the different challenges we face every day. So for example, when I was told that in order to get a first-class degree in law, I have to read all the articles and all the books and complete all my reading list, that is very much the map. That is the rule that I'm given. But when it comes to the territory and actually doing the degree itself, you realise that actually the map is slightly wrong. You don't really need to read everything. You don't need to read all the books and all the articles in order to get a first. The reality is that you can read 1, 2, or maybe 3 articles instead of, all 10 articles, because once you've read those 3 articles, you've got the gist, you understand the main point. And the more important thing isn't actually reading the stuff, but forming an opinion about it and being able to use that knowledge wisely and correctly in the exam itself. So remember that the map is not the same as the territory. The second mental model I've enjoyed recently is the circle of competence, and the idea of the circle of competence is to not let your ego drive what you know and understand and eventually learn, but actually learn based on what you're good at and what you're bad at. So if you start learning things thinking, I already know everything, this is easy, I've got no weaknesses, you're not actually going to be able to learn stuff very well at all. So what you really want to be able to do is identify what you're competent at, what is your skill, what do you currently understand and not understand, and use that as your starting point to decide what you're going to learn next. For example, I've been trying to learn maths recently, and this is something that I've been fascinated by for a long time, but I won't talk about that right now. But the idea is that when I've been doing my maths and I've been going through the different topics, I've been marking whether or not I found it easy or difficult on a sort of continuous scale. And that way, when it comes to revising those topics later, I can instantly see where my weaknesses, where my vulnerabilities are, and I can focus my learning more on those topics. So the idea of the circle of competence then is to not just learn and focus on the areas that we already know, but to also identify the areas that we're weakest and to build those up and not just accept that we're already great at everything, because that's never ever the case. So the third mental model I've been really enjoying recently is first principles thinking. And first principles thinking allows us to reverse engineer situations by splitting apart what are the key components and the key facts from what are the actual assumptions of that thing. And by doing this, we can come up with some really clever and creative solutions to difficult problems. And one of the best examples I can think of is Elon Musk.
I think it's also important to reason from first principles.
When he originally decided that he wanted to send a rocket to Mars, and he went to a bunch of different people and asked them, okay, how much is this going to cost me to send a rocket to Mars? And they went back to him and said, it's going to cost somewhere like $60 to $70 million. And for Musk, this was like an astronomical price. He wasn't prepared to pay that much money. So he went back to the drawing board and applied first principles thinking. And this thinking was essentially looking at the rocket, breaking down the components and having a think about how much would this actually cost to build. And by going through that process, he was able to work out that he could construct that same rocket for about 10 times less than what was originally quoted. So we can use this first principles thinking to break down these very difficult challenges and come up with these creative solutions, such as finding a cheaper way to do things, a quicker way to do things, or even like a higher quality way to do things. And I've used a very similar process when it comes to creating different businesses. I've created a bunch of different businesses, a load of them have failed, but one of the businesses that I really liked, which hasn't actually worked out, but the idea was great, was Impulse. And Impulse was essentially me using first principles thinking to break down what is meant by shopping and e-commerce, and also what's meant by social media. And by breaking down the core components of both shopping and social media, I was able to create a platform which merged the two concepts into a social shopping platform. And it's a really fun way to basically take these difficult concepts and ideas, merge them together, and you create this new beautiful solution to something which maybe no one's ever thought of before. The fourth mental model I really like is the thought experiment. And the thought experiment is something that's used a lot in subjects like maths and physics. And the whole idea is, instead of buying a bunch of equipment and doing an actual physical experiment, we can sit down and find a comfy place and just think about what the potential consequences of our decisions or actions may be. And one of the most famous examples is from Albert Einstein. He had a bunch of different thought experiments throughout his career, but the one that led to special relativity essentially saw him envisaging a train going past a platform and how different observers would have viewed lightning striking that train. And from this thought experiment, he was able to determine that time is relative, it's different for different observers, and that completely changed the way that we looked at physics. And we can use that same example, the same idea of a thought experiment, to and apply it to our own lives. So for example, if I was trying to choose the modules that I want to do next year, and I had a choice between, let's say, criminal law and commercial law, I can have a look at each of those options and decide how would this alter or change my life. So with criminal law, maybe I'll find it interesting because I'll be learning about manslaughter and murder and assault and battery and all these different things. And maybe even later than that, I'm going to become a criminal barrister, for example, and I'll be defending these sorts of people and I'll be getting this amount of money. And then on the other hand, you can look at commercial law and the sort of things that you're going to be learning if you did commercial law, and the city life that you may be living after that, and so on and so forth. So through this thought experiment, we can see how our different choices, our different actions, or different potential actions may lead to different further consequences in the future. And as a result, it helps us to make better decisions in the present. The fifth mental model I really like is second order thinking. And the whole idea behind second order thinking is that instead of stopping at the thought of what is the first consequence of an action, you think about what the subsequent consequences of those actions too. So for example, if you're eating a chocolate bar, you may think that the first consequence is it's going to be really nice, I love chocolate, I want to eat this chocolate bar. But the second order thought, or the second consequence, may be if I continue to eat chocolate bars, that's going to make me feel fat, or it will make me fat, and therefore should I actually eat that chocolate bar? So second order thinking in that scenario could make you change your decision about eating the chocolate bar. You may think, okay, instead I'm going to eat something healthy. In the same way, if we're trying to decide what job we want to do, and let's say for example in the case of law, you do a law degree because you want to become a lawyer, and a lawyer is a well-respected job and you get lots of money, that would be great. But then if you do second order thinking, you may decide, is being a lawyer actually something I really want to do? Is it something I'm going to find fulfilling? Is it meaningful? And will I be happy? And so you can see how second order thinking takes your thoughts one step further, and that extra step in thinking could ultimately change your decision. And so it's a really nice little idea when it comes to thinking about particularly difficult ideas where you don't really know what the future consequence of that action could be. So sit down, have a think about those second order consequences, and really think about the long-term effects of those actions. The sixth mental model I've been really enjoying recently is probabilistic thinking. And the whole idea here is that we can't 100% know what's going to happen in the future, but we can make a best estimate or best guess about what is potentially going to happen by looking at certain factors. So for example, if we're looking at the sort of questions that may come up in our exam at the end of the year, we don't 100% know what that's going to be, but we can look at certain factors such as the things that the lecturer has said during lectures, or the common themes that keep propping up every single year during the exams, or maybe even looking at the sort of questions that you ask during your seminars, because they tend to guide the sort of topics that are going to come up in your exam as well. So probabilistic thinking here is just looking at the sort of facts and the scenarios you have in front of you and deciding what is the most likely thing to happen. And from there you can make better decisions. The seventh mental model I really like is inversion, and the whole point of this is that instead of working forward through a problem, we turn it upside down and start from the end point and work backwards. So for example, let's say you have a problem with your productivity. When you try to work through the problem forwards, you go, how can I be more productive? You start looking at how you can type quicker, how you can read and learn more effectively and efficiently, and all these sorts of things. You start deciding that I need to use the Pomodoro technique to focus better. But by turning the problem on its head, inverting the problem and working backwards, you actually ask yourselves, how can I deal with the problems or the pitfalls to my productivity? And through that process, you determine that, okay, me looking at my notifications and social media too often is actually the reason why I'm not being very productive. And from there, you can create a much more effective solution to your productivity problem. In this scenario, that would be taking your phone and throwing it away or putting it, chucking it to the other side of your room. So by inverting a problem, we can actually create and think of a much more effective solution to our problem. The eighth mental model I've been looking at is Occam's razor, and Occam's razor says that when you've got both a simple explanation and a complex explanation for something, it's often the simple explanation that's going to be correct. And a good example of this would be, let's say that you failed a test or failed an exam. The simple explanation is that you didn't study hard enough, you didn't put in the hours, and as a result you failed. But the more complex sort of explanation for this would be like a conspiracy theory. It'd be like, the teacher didn't like me, so they decided they would go out of their way to make sure I failed. And so in those sort of situations where there's both a simple and a complex explanation, it's probably going to be that simple thing. And in the same way, you could think of something like, I don't know, when you're ill, I've got a headache. Yes, sure, it could be something like the Black Death, but it's much more likely that it's just going to be a little headache. You can have an ibuprofen and you're going to be fine in about 10 or 15 minutes. So from this, I learned that I need to be satisfied with the simple explanations, because more often than not, they are going to be correct, and that saves me so much headache later on down the line. The last mental model I've been looking at is very similar to Occam's razor, and it's called Hanlon's razor. And with Hanlon's razor, the whole idea is that we shouldn't attribute bad results to bad actors. So let's say that the boss was going to bring us in for a meeting, and we were expecting him to say lots of nice things about us and maybe give us a pay rise. But then at the last minute, he decides to cancel that meeting. Now, a lot of us would attribute that action to malice. We would think that, oh God, the boss doesn't like us anymore, maybe he's actually going to fire us in the end. But the more realistic cause of that action was because the boss had something more urgent that came up at the last minute and he wants to delay this meeting till later. And similarly, when we have a co-worker who won't share knowledge with us, a lot of us think that, oh, this co-worker wants to keep the knowledge to themselves so that they can, get promoted faster and win the boss's trust. Whereas in reality, when a co-worker doesn't give us something that we want or some knowledge that we want, it's usually because they're a little bit busy at that time. So we shouldn't really attribute these sort of bad results to the malice of the other person. Instead, we should look at it as stupidity or a mistake or something which has nothing to do with the other person's attitude, but just because of some circumstance that has arisen. I just think that so much of life stress could be avoided by understanding this mental model and the rest of the mental models that I've already talked about. So I really do encourage you to have a think about these mental models and see where in your life you could be applying them and how they can make your life so much better. If you have any questions at all, then please do leave them in the comment section below and I'll get straight back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.